On behalf of the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation and Metrolinx, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Ontario Smart Mobility Readiness Forum. We're delighted to have so many of you join us here today. As some of you may or may not know, I'm Raed Kadri and I'm head of the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather. OCI's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across this province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. We are thankful to the First Nation, the Métis, Inuit, peoples who have cared for these territories since the immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of Ontario and all of the communities across the province. Today's forum will take a look at the use of micromobility devices like e-scooters and e-bikes and micro-utility devices like sidewalk robots. These devices have gone through a lot of innovation over the last few years, with many municipalities pursuing pilots and initiatives to navigate the challenges and opportunities that come with their deployment. Today's speakers will shine some light on some of the key issues and lessons learned and takeaways from such initiatives. We hope that today's session will support your work by providing insights into how to deploy micromobility and micromobility devices, micro-utility devices across your own communities. I'd like to now introduce my colleague and your moderator for today, Asad Farouk, Manager of Strategic Initiatives with us at OVIN. Thank you. Enjoy the sessions.
Thank you so much, Raed. Good morning, everyone. My name is Asad Farouk, and it is my pleasure to be moderating the panel discussion today. We've got an exciting discussion planned for today and a great lineup of speakers. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items, as I said earlier at the beginning of the session. Please make sure you're muted unless you're speaking. We will be holding all questions until the end. And a reminder that the session today will be recorded and made available online on the OVIN website. So let's go to our panel, the distinguished panel we've got, a very fascinating, interesting set of panelists that we've got today. So we have today with us Bern Grush, the Executive Director at Urban Robotics Foundation, Charissa Ayogna, who is the Project Manager at the City of Toronto with Transportation Services team, Omar Chaudhry, Project Lead with the City of Ottawa in the Transportation and System Management team, and Shauna Braille, an Associate Professor at the Institute of Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. So before we hear about these devices in detail and what future we're looking at and what are some of the practical next steps and considerations for the stakeholders in this field, I will briefly introduce the panelists. And of course, this will not do justice to the incredible work they're doing. Then I will offer the opportunity to each speaker to briefly share any additional details that I might have missed or any particular work that they would like to highlight before moving on to the panel discussion. So let's move to the exciting introductions. Bern Grush in the panel is the Executive Director of Urban Robotics Foundation, a Canadian nonprofit dedicated to coordinating urban robotics policies across jurisdictions. The foundation brings together various experts to create standards, guidelines, and certification methods to ensure the robotic passenger and goods systems are safe, managed, and contribute to improve livability for cities and the people. Bern is a transportation innovator and entrepreneur in automated vehicles, parking reform, and road pricing with extensive experience in human factors and system design engineering. Bern's forte is the interplay between people and technology in urban contexts, as reflected in his 2018 textbook, The End of Driving, a book on transportation systems and public policy planning for autonomous vehicles. The next panelist is Charissa Ayogna, who has worked in transportation planning for over 10 years. As project manager at the City of Toronto, she leads the city-wide study on micro-utility devices in Transportation Services Policy and Innovation Unit. Her work includes innovation transportation technologies and transportation policy making in the public realm. Previously, she has worked as a transit planner, overseeing multi-billion-dollar planning studies for Toronto's transit programs, including Smart Track, Relief Line, Ontario Line, Eglinton West LRT, and the Scarborough Subway Extension. She co-authored the council report on fare integration, which led to the implementation of the discounted double fare program between Metrolinx and the TTC. Shona Braille is our next panelist, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Management and Innovation, University of Toronto, Mississauga. As an economic geographer and urban planner, her research focuses on the transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. Braille's research encompasses studies of broad urban economic challenges and transformations associated with the 21st century cities, including the impacts of COVID-19 on cities, the relationship between cities and the digital platform economy, with a particular emphasis on ride-hailing and shifts in urban governance, policy, planning in connection to innovation and technological change. Omar Chaudhry is the project lead, the next panelist, for transportation system management at the City of Ottawa. He has been developing and implementing technology solutions for over 25 years on projects across the United States and Canada. His work currently focuses on new technologies in intelligent transportation systems, connected automated vehicle, and new mobility spaces to assist in improving mobility, traveler information, and traffic management for residents. I will now offer the opportunity for each speaker to briefly share any additional details or any particular work that they would like to highlight before moving on to the very exciting panel discussion. So, Shona, I wonder if we could start with you first. Tell us a bit about yourself and maybe share some highlights from the work you've done in this area, like the report on robotic cargo transport you co-authored for Transport Canada. Over to you, Shona.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. And to learn from all of the speakers about micromobility and micro-utility initiatives and devices and plans for the future of Ontario. I think it's a very exciting time where mobility is concerned, and thinking about how mobility plays such a key role in the way people have opportunities to move about in cities and to improve quality of life, quality of access to employment, and access to recreation, social activities, services, groceries, etc. So mobility is absolutely fundamental to the way in which people live, and mobility is changing. And it's fascinating how mobility is changing and how new innovations and new ways of thinking and new ideas about how people should be enabled to get around cities are actually being experimented with across Canada, across the world, and in Ontario cities. I am trained, as you said, as an urban planner and an economic geographer. And I first came to work on mobility related issues in about 2015, when you may recall that many cities across Canada, particularly Toronto was one of the first, as well as Edmonton and Calgary, grappling with what to do about the emergence of ride hailing firms in our midst, and whether or not to allow ride hailing firms to operate, and whether or not to allow ride hailing services to operate. And so I come to this with an interest in both the regulatory perspective as well as the implications for our cities' economies, what the impact of new mobility services mean for urban economic change and transformation and disruption, and also how they might change the way in which we use land and design our cities. And I've spent many years studying the emergence of ride hailing. I actually originally thought that it was going to be a simple decision, like a flip of a switch. Either we say yes or we say no to ride hailing, and then the conversation is over. And I have a colleague to thank for encouraging me to continue on. And actually, it was great advice, and it's a really fascinating field of study. The emergence and the integration of micromobility devices and micro-utility devices is really another thread in thinking about how do we get people and goods around in our cities. So about a year and a half ago, I was asked to look at the role of autonomous sidewalk robots and delivery drones in Canada, and to look at preparedness, jurisdictional scans, the economics of delivery by these means, and as well some of the challenges and opportunities. And I think we'll get to talk about more of these challenges and opportunities later on. So what I want to say is that I think one of the most important pieces that we need to keep in mind here is not just about whether or not the technology exists and whether or not there's an interest in implementing and deploying new services, but what the politics of implementation and deployment and regulation looks like, and how we get both the conversation and the information and the data needed to make good decisions and to influence decision making and policy, but also thinking about what kinds of changes are needed to get to the world in which we are moving to. So first we have the pandemic and we have issues around mobility and transmission of disease. We have a climate crisis. We have an equity crisis, micromobility and micro-utility devices, as well as a lot of other new kinds of mobility services provide, and existing mobility services, quite to be frank, right? Public transit and the private automobile, these all play a role. But we do need to think about kinds of changes do we need to make, what kind of compromises and new allowances do we need to make in order to move to this sort of next era of mobility. And it requires hard choices, and it will require some giving up of space that's been devoted to other uses, and that's hard. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And certainly we'll be discussing all of these things as we head into the panel. Thank you for sharing that. Next, Omar, can I please ask you to share a bit more about yourself and the projects that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Appreciate the invitation. I'm really glad to be on the panel here with my colleagues. So, my background really comes in from the technology side. I'm a transportation engineer by heart, but graduating right around the internet came out, and it was the deviation that left me sort of in that mixed world. So I've been involved in some electronic toll collection systems over the years, advanced traveler information rolling out when the internet and cell phones started to make do, and the 511 telephone systems that were installed in the US back in 2021, 2022, or sorry, 2001, 2002. And then into the advanced weather information systems and how better data could actually drive the winter maintenance operations for agencies. And then through that time, I took a detour into the startup world for a number of years. So I sort of bring that hat as the private sector as well. And then now the last couple of years been working on our initiatives here at the City of Ottawa and connected and automated vehicles, as well as leading some efforts in the e-cargo bikes, low-speed vehicles, and supporting the e-scooter program. So this is a great panel and great opportunities. And sooner or later, the new rules for sidewalk robots or micro-utility devices will be coming out, and that file will probably fall onto me. So I'm glad to be here and listening and learning from my colleagues as well. So take away from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Over to you, Teresa. Could you tell us a bit more about yourself and the work at the City of Toronto surrounding the use of innovative transportation technologies?
No problem. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here and speak on this panel. So thank you just off the bat for having me here. The work at City of Toronto on micro-utility devices, of course, like everyone else in transportation and innovation, has been just rolling and coming towards us at a force, and understanding how we then understand the implications and the impact of these type of disruptive technologies is what I do. As you mentioned in my bio, I have more of a transit background, so I'm fairly new to this team, having just started, at the end of last year in 2021. So this has been a whole new sort of ball game for me, understanding and picking up and learning from my colleagues, including those around the table on the panel today. And just getting a sense of what are the impacts of these type of disruptive technologies, particularly micro-utility devices, when it comes to the accessibility community. That has been the main focus at the City of Toronto, understanding what the impact on these vulnerable populations are, and then understanding the impacts that it has at the economic level, what the industry looks like, and pretty much everything that Shauna mentioned earlier with the environmental implications, how this changes how goods and services are delivered, the freight industry. It's just such a huge impact. The drop is one particular spot, the ripple effect is huge. And just unpacking that and understanding how the city as policymakers and regulators as well, what our role is when it comes to understanding these type of disruptive devices. that is our role. We just started off earlier this year on this particular file, and it's something that will be ongoing over the next few months and into the next year as well.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Over to you, Brian. Please share a bit more about the foundation and the other great work that you're doing. Please shed some light on that.
Thank you, and so glad to be here, both with the two cities that are sort of leading the conversation, certainly in Ontario anyway, Toronto and Ottawa. Also I've known Shauna's work for quite a while, but really admire that. So really happy to be on the panel. One of the things that I was asked recently was, so like, tell us what are all the things that are going to happen. So what are all the things about, we call them sidewalk robots. The standard that I'm working on calls them public mobile robots. We call them here on this conversation micro utility device. Lots of names for these things. Whatever we call them, it's almost certain, because of a number of reasons that we can explore, they're going to become far more common than what we had expected to be robotech. We had expected robotic taxis, robotic passenger vehicles, and that has lagged all sorts of problems, edge cases, and difficulties in that environment. And it now looks like these micro utility devices or public mobile robots are going to come up much faster, so that I would say that we could expect very, very many more goods kilometers traveled in these kinds of devices than passenger kilometers traveled, for example. So that's the kind of thing that will happen over the next few years. Importantly, these devices have very many more uses besides delivery. I mean, they have surveillance, they have winter maintenance, salting and snow plowing, sweeping, and it's all sorts of things that they can be designed for. So that's all in play. So if you look 8 years from now, will most of such robots, wherever they happen to be operating, will they be mostly delivery? Will they be mostly maintenance? That's not really very well understood. The assumption is it's about delivery, but that's not necessarily a well-formed assumption necessarily. It's also the case, it's very interesting, is that we are constantly waiting for these very high levels of automation in passenger vehicles, which we are barely able to achieve so far. It's always next year. These devices, these micro utility devices, don't require that high level of automation, because there are teleoperators, and those teleoperators might be doing 1% of the navigation. They might be doing 10%. They might be doing 90%, and that doesn't matter to the person who's receiving their goods. Those issues, as long, and the city is concerned that they're safe, but the users that are using these devices, they only care that they get their goods. And the logistics operators have solved this problem now and only need to have the systems be good enough so that one operator can manage 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 robots. So they don't have to have one-to-one. So all of these things are in play that are really presenting us with a large number of opportunities, and to Shauna's point, a lot of and also Teresa's point, there's a lot of challenges. One of those challenges are people that may have disability, maybe on wheelchairs, maybe blind, and that sort of thing. The standard that I work on is not focused only on that, but that is a central theme of the standard, to make these spaces safe and so on. But let me leave it there now. There's certainly a lot of complexity and a lot of opportunity, but in my summary of this is that we're not going to achieve this potential at any scale other than 10 or 12. We're not going to be able to have multiple fleets delivering and sweeping and cleaning and plowing and so forth, unless we have you can think of it as a sidewalk traffic act. I mean, we have a highway traffic act. We understand how to use vehicles on the roadway, but we don't know how to use these vehicles at volume on the sidewalk mixed with people. It's a very difficult problem, and that is the main thing that the standard is attempting to achieve. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Bern. Thank you. What an impressive set of profiles. I hope the audience got some takeaways just from these interesting work that our panelists are doing. I think this just gave a lot of alluded to a lot of opportunity and challenges that we'll be discussing very shortly. Now let's move to our panel discussion. I am certainly excited, and I hope you are too. I'm also wondering what an exciting set of information we'll be unfolding with our discussion. With such a distinguished set of panelists in the room, virtual room. So let me just let me just introduce the first question here, and I would ask Teresa to really, take us 5 years into the future. Help us understand the meaning of micro-utility and how will micro-utility change our lives in the next 5 years?
No, absolutely. So micro-utility devices are effectively technologies that can operate using any type of power other than muscular power. So that effectively means a human can't put their hands on it and physically manipulate and move this device around. It has to be done either automatedly or through remote control. And a lot of technology has advanced over time, such as the introduction of the 4G and 5G network that has allowed us to use these, types of communications with devices like this over time. And then these devices are items that actually transports itself and conducts a task, for example, transporting goods and services. So we have generally categorized it at the city in 4 different groups. So the first type of device that we understand around micro-utility devices are personal assistance devices. So these typically follow a person and provide a service or assistance to that person. The next group is typically what we've seen mostly around North America and Europe, and right here in Toronto as well, is the delivery devices. So these devices are smaller devices where you can deliver food and drink products or any other items that can fit into the box, and then it's delivering it from the business to the recipient or the customer that's requesting that item. Category C is a service device. So we're also seeing this more and more in North America, even here in Ontario. These type of devices implement infrastructure and maintain a type of service or do a type of service in the immediate path. And this could include snow removal, litter collection, lawn mowing. And then finally, the last category that we define it as is scanning and surveilling devices. And these can scan and survey physical area. It could perhaps be used to support the parking authority if there's any parking violations or infractions, with the police services if there's any type of misconduct that's happening in the public right of way, and use that to notify that team to have a physical person come in. So it can actually expand, the capabilities that these groups can do. When we consider the history of transportation, it is an industry that's constantly changing and advancing, and how we, move from place to place has effectively transformed over time. And technology will continue to do that and change over time. Micro-utility devices is just one more example of that type of disruptive technology in transportation. And devices like these are already impacting how we think about the transportation network. So how it's changing our lives in the next 5 years, it's already doing that. It will continue to do that over the next little while. As policymakers, we're trying our best to anticipate the applications and the use cases for things like these devices, and then also the level of uptake that they present. So we're trying to anticipate that. What would that actually look like? We are starting to use a tool called Foresight. It's different from forecasting. Forecasting is something where you look at past trends and data, and you anticipate based on past trends what that trajectory looks like. Foresight is something where you're looking at various options into the future. What's the best case, worst case, medium case, ideal case scenario, and utilizing that tool to sort of anticipate what's going to happen over the next 5 years is sort of how it's changing our work on a day-to-day basis, at least for our team at the City of Toronto as policymakers of this type of innovation and policy making for innovative technologies. In the next 5 years, I think the innovative and technology industry, of course, will have devices that are going to be well improved from what we're seeing today. That's just the typical trajectory of technology. They're just improving on past models. What we need to then do is understand the increased applications and use cases for these devices, understand how affordable they are, how efficient they are. And once we do that, we'll have to be able to continue to understand what the applications are, what the impacts are, what the implications, and eventually how we can then operationalize these devices and apply them to these use cases, and then potentially regulate them as well to ensure that we can protect the health and safety of our vulnerable populations. As I mentioned, one of the main concerns that we have is around our accessibility community. Taking the careful care of what these impacts and what these potential applications are for the community is something that we need to look at. It poses its challenges, but it also poses its opportunities as well. There's a lot of great opportunities for us to improve, livelihoods of these groups and understand how, the public right of way can be a better place as a result of these devices. So how it's changing our lives in the next 5 years, I think we're going to continue seeing these type of disruptive technologies, and it's just changing the process of how we approach regulating, understanding the impacts of these devices. Is something that's happening today, and it will continue to happen over the next few years.
Thank you for sharing those insights. Even the tools like Foresight and a lot of things are happening in communities and things need to be considered for use cases. That's certainly great to hear. Just building on that, I will pass it to Omar to share a bit more about the concept of micromobility and also taking us into the future, where we are in 5 years and what it's looking like for us, Omar.
I was going to say, I'm glad that Carissa got the harder one of the two questions because certainly the sidewalks are the big part of the right of way that are in play. I mean, we've had micromobility, if you really want, for 100+ years, right? Ever since the wheel, we've had some way, shape, or form micromobility. It's been the bicycle, which now are e-bikes. So now we have add a little bit of electric power, so we can all be Tour de France kind of style riders. We had kick scooters that now have e-kick scooters, so now you can go a little bit easier and go faster and not have to keep your foot on that on the ground propelling you. And then we have skateboards, bike share, all of these things. So really micromobility is small, lightweight vehicles that allow someone to operate or someone to get transported from A to B at a relatively low speed. Everything at Transport Canada regulates vehicles that are above 32 kilometers an hour. So I kind of use that 32 kilometer an hour speed limit as the micromobility versus a vehicle or motor vehicle. Like when I watch Murdoch Mysteries and you see, the old days of people walking on the streets of Toronto, and then a car comes by and everybody's, freaking out about that, a streetcar and so forth, all those changes that we've had, we've slowly migrated things. Things don't change as quickly as I think we sometimes expect them to. And Fern had sort of highlighted that with the robo taxis, and they haven't yet gotten there, but they're slowly getting here, next year kind of thing. And a lot of that sort of revolves around what in the tech side of things that they call the technology adoption curve, right? So you got about 2% of the people who are really, the innovators, the extremely leading edge kind of thing. Then you got maybe, 10, 12, 13% of people who are those early adopters. So they're the ones who will try it, and get involved really early. But the majority, whether it's the early or late majority, that's 70% of people that sort of come in towards the end. And then you have the really laggards who, over my dead body, will I ever try one of those kind of things? And so you have that sort of curve, right? And that technology and the adoption of that. As humans, status quo is usually, because we know what it is. There's no uncertainty. So jumping off of that cliff, right? When Shauna was talking about the ride hailing, when that first came out, and I'd never get in a car with someone I don't know, but I've taken a taxi before. And where and why is that different? And that sort of mentality was something that people had to overcome. And now people, a few years later, people have said, yeah, not a problem. The companies have migrated, the technology has migrated, the business plans have migrated. So all of these things slowly change over time. And, for micromobility here in the city of Ottawa, we have e-scooters. We've had them now for 2 years, and then this year is our 3rd year. The progress of the technology and what the technology can do, the first year I call them sort of the dumb e-scooters. They had a go and a stop, and that was about it. Now, this year here in the city, they're just rolling out after Canada Day, and they will have sidewalk detection. They will have enhanced parking capabilities. They have capability of using real-time correction and or computer vision and AI to identify where they are as they're driving along. So their pinpoint accuracy will be a little bit better. And we're also requiring them to actually emit a continuous sound. It should be probably the first here in North America, if not globally, requiring the companies to emit a sound, and largely, to support those in the accessibility community who, we had the problem of sidewalk riding. Well, that's where people who are, both pedestrians and those with accessibility needs are on the sidewalk and not being able to hear these electric vehicles coming, puts a scare in people. And so, how can you move forward? So it's a little bit of policy, a little bit of pilots and learning what you need to do and the things that, we don't know what we don't know, and moving along slowly to get to a point where we can get back to status quo and everybody's happy and everything is a-okay.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for sharing that and sharing those examples. This really took me back to the time when I got this scooter as a teenager, as a present. It was just a toy at that time. It was recently introduced, not knowing we'll be discussing less than 2 decades ago, 2 decades later, with experts in this room talking about how it could really shape the future for all of us. So it's really exciting to hear that. Now I think, thank you so much, Charisse and Omar, for really taking us into the future. We're going to shift some gears here in this panel. And we're going to talk a bit more about what are the micro utility and mobility challenges that are not being discussed or should be considered by policymakers and small, medium enterprises or startups. Obviously, we have already started that, sort of alluded to those things, but I'll ask Bern if you could shed some light on that, please. Bern, you're on mute. Can you please unmute yourself, Bern?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
What I was saying is that there really are a lot of issues that need to be considered, and we just have time to talk about a couple of them. One of my first ones that I want to point out, and I'm concerned about many safety issues, and one of those key safety issues is where all the action is, where all the mishaps occur, or most mishaps occur, not with any particular thing, but with all vehicles, and that's our intersections and crosswalks. And I just want you to consider that if you consider a delivery vehicle in a city, and the average delivery is something a little over a kilometer, about 1.25 kilometers on average, that's the current average. These things change as the technology changes, but right now that's what it looks like. So if you're in a city such as Toronto or Ottawa, you could expect, if I'm going from, let's just say I'm going to deliver from a restaurant to a residence, you would expect to cross about 9 intersections on average and you have to come back because you're delivering from A to B, and then you have to go back to the restaurant to get the next order because it's a personal delivery for one person sort of thing. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them. That kind of a vehicle, those are the small sort of delivery vehicles that we're sort of aware of. Those would cross on average 18 intersections or crosswalks or roadways or whatever on its way from A to B and back. You multiply that out. You take the company that has the most deliveries now. It's a company from Estonia called Starship, and that company claims something on the order of 1 million deliveries a year. So if you multiply that out, they're crossing an intersection 7/24 or 24/7. They're crossing an intersection 4 times a second worldwide. Well, that number is going to skyrocket soon. So any cities that use these at scale, I'm not talking about a trial of 3 devices. I'm talking about Milton Keynes has 125 or more by now, but the last time I looked, 125 devices. So start to think about how many roadways they would be crossing and so forth. So what is the solution to that? There is already a body of electronic solutions for automated vehicles, interestingly, called V2I, Vehicle to Infrastructure. And there's data packets that explain intersections and explain what light is going to change next and so forth. Now, the standard that we're drafting uses those packets, but how that works is that it doesn't work directly that the robot's reading something from the intersection, because there's no way we can change all of our intersections. I mean, it's going to take us 2 decades to make all those changes. How it works is all remotely through GPS. We know where the device is, and the information about what the intersection is going to do or its structure is going back to the teleoperator. So there is a way to make robots be able to, for example, to ask for or wait for a walk signal all of that's done in the cloud. There's no equipment for them. In other words, there's no alteration at the intersection other than the intersection, the software on those intersection control systems. Why I'm saying all that, that's one facet of many, many facets that need to be understood, because, you know, we're all focused on the sidewalk and the space on the sidewalk. And that's important, but the intersection is even more important. And we haven't been talking about that nearly as much as concerns about the sidewalk itself. That's one thing. I want to throw in another one, well, you know, just to answer that question. And this has to do with, it's known as orchestration. Orchestration systems are, it's like a air traffic control system, for example. So you can't decide to fly from one airport to another without a flight plan and without a landing spot, a time at which you're expected to land. And of course, your flights can be delayed, and then that has to be reshaped, reshuffled, and so forth. If we're going to have robots on sidewalks and maybe bike lanes or maybe road shoulders and so forth, we don't want to have too many at one place at one time. We control cars with streetlights, and we still have gridlock. But if we have robots from multiple vendors traveling when they wish, because they have their job to do, then we could get congestion. Well, where's that congestion going to be? Well, it's going to be at the intersections where you could have, instead of 2 or 3 robots waiting to cross the light, what if you had 15? Then what about the pedestrians and so forth? So congestion management, which we're thinking about sort of pedestrian safety, which is important. But congestion management, there's no mechanism for that, because we don't have any way to prevent a particularly large number of robots to use the same space at the same time. So those are the 2 big things: the intersections, you know, besides safety and accessibility. But the next 2 biggest things are intersections and multi-vendor orchestration, mostly ignored until now, and the key fundamental issues of the standard that I'm working on, which permits cities to think about how are they going to manage those things, how will they regulate those things, what language will they explain those things to, and how will they register vehicle fleets and insist that those vehicle fleets follow those rules, whatever those sidewalk rules or congestion rules and crosswalk rules and so forth. How will the cities define what those are, and then registered fleets in a way that those fleets understand how to follow all those rules. So that's sort of my major kind of concern for these devices in our shared public spaces.
Thank you so much, Bern, for sharing that. Even the concept of congestion management, quite interesting there. So I'll pass it next to Shauna. And Shauna, if you could just speak a bit about micromobility and microutility technology and concepts, and how we think they'll merge with the other transport options in the future, and what will the outcome be? So if you can just shed a light on that, please.
Definitely. So as I alluded to in my sort of earlier comments, I think we as in regulators, municipalities, governments need to think about making space for other types of vehicles. And there's nothing to say that existing or privileged ways of getting around are the only ways to prioritize moving around. And in particular, I'm referring to the amount of space in our cities and communities that are devoted to the private automobile, the incredible costs that this has in terms of infrastructure, in terms of emissions, in terms of accessibility, and in terms of land use as well. And so we do need to start thinking about how else can we get around, and how do we make sure that we make space for this and make space in lots of ways. There are good reasons to permit micromobility devices in particular, as an alternative to the private automobile, and sometimes as an alternative to public transit, or in addition to public transit. So for instance, in Taipei, they have a bike share system that is connected to the transit system, and you get off at a subway stop and there is often a bike share right beside it. And the ticket that got you onto the subway gets you a rental of that bike. it's a way of connecting the two ways of getting around to expand the mobility network in the city. And it's a great idea. We need more of that, not less of that. As Byrne said, there are, most delivery trips, but also most trips in the city's core are actually less than something like 5 kilometers. And so there's something to say that these are especially suitable for micromobility devices. There are some, some suggestion that that almost half of all trips in the city center are these short trips. So how do we move people out of automobiles and out of larger vehicles into these kind of more personal devices? Again, there's the potential to reduce emissions, to potentially reduce congestion, depending very much on street and mobility network design. So we may need to think about designing even more complete streets. One of the challenges of introducing new types of vehicles and devices is around passenger safety and the safety of people outside, not using those devices. Does that mean that our streets need to have all these separated uses, a lane for transit, a lane for private automobiles, a lane for electrified vehicles, a lane for human powered vehicles, and a lane, and a lane for pedestrians? And what benefits does that offer, but also what challenges does that then result in? And that's a really tricky question. I love looking at the engineering models and simulations showing how these might all work together. But it is, we didn't always have the system we have today. We didn't always promote this idea of complete streets and separated bike lanes and separated sidewalks. And so this is yet another progression that we need to be thinking about. There are challenges, as have been raised, challenges around accessibility. When in the earliest days of micromobility devices in particular, like e-scooters and e-bikes, real issues around congestion on sidewalks and how do these devices get recharged and restocked? What kinds of conflicts are there with other road or sidewalk users? Where are they stored? Are they placed in areas of the region that provide equity and equitable opportunity to access, right? So some early studies around the location of bike share showed that actually the communities in which bike shares were located were in the more in communities and neighborhoods that were already well connected and already serving sort of upper income and middle income individuals. And so in order to create better equity and accessibility, you need to really think through the mapping of these devices. A lot of the challenges are also solvable, and sometimes they're solvable by using technology, right? So the concept of geofencing, of not allowing a scooter to go beyond a certain area. I rode a e-scooter in Los Angeles a couple of times. I did always feel like I was risking my life because we rode it on the street. But we tried to go into this one area. I forget what it was called, and the scooter just stopped. It just absolutely stopped. Geofencing works, right? And you can use geofencing to protect, zones where you don't want e-scooters, where they're incompatible. And you can also use geofencing to manage the hours of operation. And you can use geofencing for other purposes as well. Cities have become, and regulators have become much more experienced with thinking through the permitting process. Which firms are allowed to operate? How many devices are they allowed to deploy? And also using the data that's collected. I mean, the amazing thing about the way in which these devices are rented and the digitization opportunities is that a tremendous amount of data is collected. The question is, who receives it, who has the access to that data, and how do you use that data and analyze the data to actually improve the system and to make sure it works even better. I think that we need to distinguish between micromobility and micro-utility devices or sidewalk robots, because again, a lot of times they operate on sidewalks, and in some places they operate on roads. One of the things we're seeing is that if municipalities decide not to regulate, that firms are either operating anyways right? So in Toronto, we had a case of a firm that was operating, and I would say the city turned the other way. But when the city actually made a decision about the inability for sidewalk robots to operate for the time being, that firm picked up and went and operated, went somewhere else. Went to Ottawa, and also went to a US city. But there's the challenge with the gray zone is that firms don't know what to do. It actually can stifle innovation and investment, but it also creates an environment in which actually firms have more power. And I don't know that governments are always thinking about this, but what we see in the States, as well as in a couple of other places, is firms coming in with their recommended regulations and shopping them around, and maybe first going to the municipal level and then going to the state or the provincial level. And we saw this with ride hailing too. So we're familiar with the role of advocacy and lobbying, and we're familiar with the idea that there are companies that are writing regulations that they're hoping that will be adopted. And in some cases in the US, these regulations have been adopted. And oftentimes firms are going to the higher level of government because it's easier to work with a state government than to run around to all the different municipalities. So I do think it's really important to think through the regulatory piece and what saying nothing does and what saying no does and what saying yes does, and thinking through the ways of how we manage these new technologies and innovations, how we create opportunities, and how we address the challenges. I think the last part of your question asked about what's going to happen in the future. And I don't know, but what I do think we're going to start to see is a merging of mobility services. And again, I think we saw this with ride hailing. Ride hailing, isn't all that distinct from taxi services in many places, in part because taxis changed to be more like ride hailing firms. They added apps. They added digital hailing. They added credit card payments online. They added tracking of where you are and the ability to order it for another person. So I think we'll also start to see a merging of mobility services. If you think about when you order delivery for dinner, you don't know how that item gets, how your meal gets to you. Maybe it came on a bike, maybe it was on an e-scooter. Yes, e-scooters are still operating in Toronto, even though they're not supposed to be. You just know that it arrives, right? So I think there's a bit of a blurring that's going to happen. Also, redundancy is an asset for mobility. It's really important to have multiple ways of enabling people to get around. And we saw this during the pandemic. We continue to see this during the pandemic, that as people choose to switch the way in which they move, we see greater interest and greater uptake and movement between types of mobility, right? So we saw, great shifts towards personal mobility as opposed to mass transit during the pandemic, and it's been very hard for transit services to recover. And then I also want to say that I think, and I hope we'll see a more nuanced debate about the benefits and the challenges. And when we talk about accessibility in particular, my dad is 83, and just this year he purchased an e-bike. And we think often of mobility technologies, whether it's micromobility or micro-utility devices, as things that are used by the younger generations. But there are a lot of healthy aging people in Canada who continue to want to be independent, who are able to continue to enjoy exercise outdoors, doing errands, traveling around by using these devices as well. And so we shouldn't discount that, because I think it's an important part of it.
Thank you, Shauna. I think with this, we have certainly not taken sort of a view of where we would be in 5 years. At least we have attempted to look at that. And I think certainly we have been able to talk about a bit of the opportunities and challenges space. Of course, this is just a start. And of course, there's a lot more things that time will unfold and experiments and pilots will unfold. But I thank all of you for sharing those stories and to really bringing us to this point to talk more about now in the next gear. What we're going to talk about is some of the opportunities in the short and long term for piloting such projects in this field. And that's where I would like Teresa to jump in and share some insights to that end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of what we're in the middle of right now. So at the City of Toronto, when it comes to piloting projects like this around micro-utility devices, Toronto actually has something called the Transportation Innovation Zone program. And this was actually created back in 2020 by Council, and it will run until 2025. And it's a designated area to test and trial out new innovative technologies in a kind of protective, contained space. So this actually takes place at Exhibition Place in Toronto, if you're familiar with it. It's actually publicly owned land. And this is the physical location of our innovation zone. And we actually had an opportunity to host a challenge back in April with the industry. And we had a few applicants as well. What happens in this particular scenario, we get to pilot in a controlled area, it's a semi-closed environment, and it doesn't necessarily replicate the typical Toronto network and the typical Toronto density that we have and the challenges that we would face when it comes to rolling out these type of devices. But we were able to actually allow staff to get better acquainted with these devices. You know, myself, I had never seen one of these devices in person. I've never seen it operated. I've never got a chance to operate it myself. I've seen it in the news quite a bit. I've heard and I've read a lot, but it's very different experiencing these devices and seeing it in person. And it really allowed our staff to be better acquainted with these devices for it. But understanding that that particular challenge was just scratching the surface of the capabilities and the applications of these devices. But what it did was it allowed us to treat that particular that particular challenge as an opportunity to collect information and research just much, as academia world does, and to inform our process as policymakers and as municipal workers about micro-utility devices. And it would then come into, very valuable use when it comes to understanding the applications, the use cases, the impacts, the implications, for example, when it comes to operationalizing it. And again, as I mentioned, the possible and eventual regulation of these devices as well. It just allows that more hands-on application to understand it. But, having pilots, having an area to do these challenges, to witness these devices in motion is just one piece of the puzzle. What we've been doing is, having a lot of conversations with, again, many people around the table at this particular forum. So larger municipalities like Toronto, what we have is a really huge challenge with density when it comes to piloting these types of technologies. Smaller, more nimble municipalities have better opportunities just to react and to help the industry and to partner a lot quicker than larger municipalities with the level of densities that Toronto has, for example, and test it out in the real world. And we've been learning from these municipalities and are in conversations with them. There are a few municipalities that's been piloting, for example, sidewalk snow removal. That's been fairly popular this past year. We've seen some of that happening. We've also seen over the past year some municipalities testing out sidewalk maintenance devices that have been scanning to understand how they can utilize that technology to help increase the capacity and the effectiveness of our sidewalk maintenance that we do every summer. I think these partnerships are very important for us to do in addition to the pilots, to have get a sense of what they've learned, what they've experienced. And we also have an opportunity to partner with academia. Of course, we are in conversations with universities like Toronto, and we're also involved with organizations like the Urban Robotics Foundation. So Toronto is a member of the Urban Robotics Foundation with Byrne, and we are participating in the discussions around what developing standards are like and what that can possibly mean and look like. And that's a very different conversation, a very different process than what we do as municipal policymakers, but an important aspect of the puzzle that we need to understand to see what that actually looks like in a document, what that actually looks like as a guidebook when it comes to understanding what the standardizations of these devices are. And I think through these conversations, we've learned that municipalities, provide many services, and micro-utility devices present a lot of opportunities for us to reconsider the delivery of these services that we provide. So for example, snow removal, lawn maintenance, these are services that Toronto, City of Toronto and other municipalities provide. And rethinking how these devices can present and understand the practicality and use cases of these particular applications when it comes to these technologies is something that we need to learn. And having the experience of witnessing and understanding other municipalities when they're actually piloting is something that we need to do, because we may discover that having these devices in our public right-of-way, for example, and I'm not saying this is the true case, we might find that there's a lot of challenges having them operate in our right-of-way. But there's a lot of great opportunities in the immediate term for us to have it in more contained property space, to experiment and explore, for example. It may not be along the stretches of every single street in Toronto, but we might find that there's an ability for us to maintain certain properties around municipal buildings or hospitals and have it more contained in that space. But we just won't be able to understand that unless we pilot it. Of course, Toronto has our challenges, so we're having, to piecemeal these conversations that we're having with different groups to sort of create a more full and complete holistic image of what it looks like. And in addition, we're just in conversation with device groups. So at the City of Toronto, we have something called the Automated Vehicles Working Group. And this particular table has over 30 agencies and divisions at the city. And this group is meant to take a more holistic approach to disruptive technologies, and micro-utility devices have been discussed at the last 2 roundtables that we've had, and getting a sense of what the different groups have to say and their concerns and what their issues and opportunities are part of that puzzle and understanding what it looks like. So yes, piloting the project and getting a sense of how it works is absolutely something that we need to continue to do in the short and long term. But it's just a small piece, and we have to continue to sort of complete the puzzle, complete the image as much as we can. And I think the different tools, the processes, and having these conversations are part of that.
Thank you, Teresa, for opening this up for us. And in the interest of time as well, we're going to have the Q&A from the rest of the team as well. What I would like now is for Omar and then Shauna and then Byrne, starting in that order, to share a bit more of what could be the immediate lessons learned or considerations for the stakeholders in this time horizon, building on what we have heard. So Omar, I will pass it to you. If you could just shed some light on the lessons learned, because you've been working on some pilots as well, and then I'll pass it to Sean and then Brian.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Thank you. I think for us, one of the things is technology is moving faster than any of us can kind of keep up with in some ways. It used to be you'd have a bike, and now you have an e-bike, and now you have an e-cargo bike, and that cargo bike can actually haul as much as a regular delivery UPS or FedEx or Canada Post vehicle, because they're changing the way they operate. So no longer they're taking a truck from outside the city, hauling everything into the city, doing all their deliveries. Now they're bringing a larger truck with one truck as opposed to 6 or 10, dropping them off on a micro distribution center, and then from there being able to run 3 or 4 loops back and forth to make those deliveries. And so the way the models are changing, because the economics of 6 people stuck in traffic for half an hour to get to where they need to deliver doesn't pay off as much as being able to have one truck and one person be able to do that. Shifting the hours on where they're working is changing as well. Right, so there's a lot of those things that are constantly changing, and as I was mentioning, there's new modalities now. We have low-speed vehicles that Canada Post will be piloting here in Ottawa. It's electric; it's up to 40 kilometers an hour, but that's for delivery. It's a smaller scale vehicle on our city streets, and e-cargo bikes for delivery of packages and mail and that kind of stuff. And so there's the merger of different ways of doing things and delivering things are changing. And when you get to, micro utility devices, the question would be, does it need to deliver just one package, or can it do multiple stops and then pick up and deliver, so that way there's fewer empty miles? There's a lot of those kind of things that kind of come into play as to figuring out how that's going to change and how we implement rules and regulations and bylaws and so forth and policies to be able to manage that constant change. The initial sidewalk robots, for example, I know a lot of them have a escort, right? Someone who's walking around behind it, but that's not always going to be the case. Byrne was talking about how a bunch of them are teleoperated, so that changes the way things. And if they do go to autonomous, there's questions about how those operate, and each one of those are different. Each one of those 3 would have to be handled differently. And having a single policy that covers everything today probably will be out of date a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. And so part of that sort of thing is policies in some ways need to be changing as well. You know, and so, you know, I think Teresa was saying, you know, about the pilots that we here in Ottawa have Area X.0. It's a facility that allows, it's 1,800 acres of land, 16 kilometers of road. We have drones and robotics companies that are operating out of there. A lot of the bigger robotics, more so for managing, you know, electrical substations or security for that. And airports are being developed there. But that doesn't mean that they can't downsize and be able to start doing deliveries of packages and so forth. And so all of those things are constantly changing. And how can you keep up policy that handles everything when everything is constantly changing is very difficult. I mean, and I know Shauna, you know, pointed out very, very well that companies were coming in originally and just, you know, throwing things out there, and people have, you know, cities have to put up the stop brakes and or stop sign and say, hey, no, you can't do that, get out. We don't know exactly how this is going to operate. And largely after Uber and Airbnb, that's been the policy and moving forward. And it, you know, Bern had mentioned it, kind of, that's potentially stifling innovation. And so how do you move and allow innovation, but also do what our duty, you know, is to make sure that the roads and the right of way are safe and secure for everybody. That, you know, it's a constant thing. And so part of it for, you know, at the city, we have been going back to council every other year or every other year to say, this is what we've learned so far. These are the tweaks that we think we need to change to be able to move forward. I know, you know, when e-cargo bikes came out, and I have to commend the province for coming out with pilot programs for different modalities. So that way we can at least decide as a municipality, do we want this or do we not want to allow this right away? But on the e-cargo bikes, there were some gray areas that a group of, you know, cities, ourselves, and through the GTHA, I should say, got together and started like, okay, what are you guys thinking? What are we thinking? Because if every municipality has totally different rules, that also stifles innovation and it stifles progress. And so where we can have sort of some general guidelines from the province, the municipalities can figure out sort of what works best and then feed that information back for future adjustments of those pilot regulations, allows us all to move forward without stopping everything from happening. So.
Thank you, Omar, for sharing that. And in a few minutes, we'll be opening questions as well, but I would like Shauna and then Brian to briefly share one or two points that they think are important considerations for the stakeholders. If you can just briefly shed light, Shauna, first you, and then Brian would wrap it up for us.
Great. I have three quick points. The first one is that the way we traditionally think about, study, regulate, organize mobility separates the idea of moving people and the idea of moving goods. You know, we organize our divisions along these lines, people or goods. We organize our policies, our regulations along these lines. And what's happening as a result of the emergence of these large platforms that actually are building networks, right? They're not building transportation, they're building transportation opportunities, but they're building networks more importantly. And those networks are flexible. And so we see during the pandemic, you know, Uber shifting very quickly the bulk of its activity from rides to the bulk of its activity from food delivery. Food delivery is not regulated. The drivers are not regulated when they deliver food. And most, you know, other than some of the labor pieces, there's little regulation there. And so we need to think more holistically about mobility. And this isn't just a challenge for communities and municipalities and governments. It's a challenge for researchers. It's a challenge for institutions, et cetera. The second one, and I think Trissa really sort of highlighted this, is that place matters. One size does not fit all for any of this kind of policy. And so, of course, as Omar said, it's really important to have that umbrella structure, but then to enable different places to be able to experiment and test out what works best for them. And the third one is very much tied to this. And Trissa, you also highlighted this, it's just the importance of collaboration and mutual learning and sharing that needs to take place amongst in particular, policymakers, decision makers, and government stakeholders, because cities and even larger levels of governments are totally overpowered by the large digital platforms who have an enormous amount of information and funding and talent and global insight. And in order to be able to operate and be effective in regulating and managing and deploying these services, there needs to be a really high degree of interaction and engagement and coordination, collaboration amongst stakeholders within a region or within the government level.
Thanks, Shauna. Bern, I'll pass the mic to you, and if you could just wrap this up for us and share one of the key or a few key considerations for the stakeholders based on the discussion.
Well, there's so much here to grab onto. I'm going to look at the expression readiness. Again, back to one of the things that's in the standard, we're developing a body of readiness metrics. Just let me use a little analogy. If you're going to have a party, there's two things to the party: is who you're going to invite, and the analogy here is what are we going to allow into our cities or streets, what companies or what devices, or and so on. And the other is for your party is your home ready, or is your venue ready? And we need to look at both. Our cities are not ready for these devices in large part, however much we want them. And the devices are not completely ready yet either. So both of these need to develop, but we need, while we're studying the devices and how do they behave and what should we do with them, we need to really ask ourselves, where is the, and I think Teresa pointed that out, at least in some cases, where can we use them? And where do we want to use them? And if we want to use them in those places, are those places ready? And you have to do them both together, because she said, well, ready for what? We don't understand the devices. But anyway, the point is that there's a loop between understanding what's possible and understanding readiness. And what I want to put under all of that is that instead of us saying, what are these devices and what should we do to be ready for them? We should be saying, wait a minute, what could these devices do that we want them to do? And instead of saying, what do you have that we'll be ready for? We should say, here's what we need. Make them like this for us. In other words, turn that equation around from us as a city. I'm talking about municipalities and jurisdictions saying what they want. And innovators will provide them, usually, for the most part, unless they're magical things that you want. But if you're asking for things that are achievable, innovators will provide them that way. Instead of waiting for them to say, here's what we have, we're coming in, and we're going to lobby you to take our things our way. So I'd like to see us turn that equation around, and I call it the readiness issue. And I'd like us to be ready for what we want to do, and for us to ask the innovators to make their systems ready for what we want. I mean, that's my sort of global opinion about all of these changes and disruptive technologies.
That was wonderful. Well, thank you, Bern. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Shauna, and thank you, Teresa. I think there's a lot of insights there. A lot of, obviously, in this time, we could only cover so much, and there's a depth and wealth of, there's a universe with this devices itself. But I think there were a couple of takeaways with each of these conversations, stories, examples that all of you brought to the table. But now I would also take the opportunity to open the questions. If someone has any question, please raise your hand or share it in the chat. And I can see there are already 2 questions. So I'm going to start with the first question. I think we only have like 8 minutes to go through them. So I'll try as much as we can cover, but let's start with the first question. And that's to you, Shauna. Would it be possible for municipalities to face legal suits launched on behalf of persons with disabilities or seniors that lose their driver's license if these local governments outright ban or place unreasonable restrictions on the use of micromobility vehicles? Is access to public spaces, use of public roads and transportation by persons with disabilities a human right? So it's a long question. If you want, I can read it again for you.
I can see it in the chat. I hope everyone else can see it. And I actually want to start by saying I don't have a full answer to this question. I think this question is really best suited to somebody with a legal background. And if I understand the question right, the person is asking whether governments could be liable to be served with a lawsuit if certain people are unable to use micromobility vehicles because they don't have the ability as stated in whatever restrictions are developed. I have to say, and actually, let me just go to the second question first, and then I can come back to the first one really briefly. But yes, access to public spaces, roads, transportation by persons with, by any person is a human right. So yes, I think that's an easy one to answer. The question about if you create rules that make people ineligible, the only rules I'm familiar with that make people ineligible to use micro mobility devices are rules around minimum age, right? To say that if you're going to use a motorized device, you have to be allowed to use a motorized device. So you have to be whatever age it is, 16 often. I can't think of any other kinds of examples, but who knows, there could be. And I think that's the kind of thing that you'd want to consult widely on. That's and maybe others have different thoughts.
Omar, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on Zoom calls either. But I think, I think Shauna's sort of right that, there's provincial regulations. We have the Highway Traffic Act, and that outlines what the province allows and doesn't allow for operation of different types of vehicles. And so that is generally the guidelines. And if, for example, the pilots that we have for low-speed vehicles, e-cargo bikes, and e-scooters, those are provincial pilots that within the stated regulations identify whether or not the municipality can opt in or not. Those kind of things are out there. Whereas, for example, I believe on the automated vehicles, it's a provincial level and not a municipal level. So there's variations in terms of how those that legislation is written, which somewhat governs what is allowed and not allowed in a municipality.
Thank you both, Shauna and Omar, for that. The next question we have, and I'll ask the panelists to jump in, whoever wish to answer that. The question I'm going to read out loud. Tunnels are being considered by the US military in the development of their urban security response strategies. Should cities consider using their many utility and subway tunnels in their autonomous vehicle planning? Cities with streams, rivers, and lakes should consider water, land, vehicle solutions as well. So would anyone want to jump in and respond to that?
I'll jump in. I know that, for example, when I was living in Boston, they had what they call the duck boats. They were old military landing vehicles that would drive around tourists around the city and then hop into the Charles River and go down the Charles River. So, I think it really comes down to the economics behind it and whether or not those sort of tools. I know if you go out to Vancouver, you have a lot of water taxis and other types of vehicles as well. So I think it depends upon the location. I'm not sure, Toronto, I guess, I'm not sure if you'd basically go out to the island, but there are ferries already out to the island. So in Ottawa, we've got a number of bridges, and we do have ferries on both ends of the city to go across the Ottawa River over to Quebec. So, from the water side of things, that's covered. I'm not sure on the tunnels. Tunnels are expensive. I know that Elon Musk has been rolling out tunnels in Los Angeles and driving individual vehicles through those tunnels. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best use or most economic use of the technology, but where we have subways and light rail vehicles, mass transit enabling those tunnels, I think those are probably the more effective use of that sort of technology.
Thank you, Omar. The next question is, how receptive have the e-scooter manufacturers been to the stricter requirements and noise making, more accurate geofencing, etc.? Have they taken these features to and from other markets? This is for you, Omar.
They've been as receptive as those who've actually submitted a proposal within the RFP. The technology, as I said, is moving. And so not every company has implemented or can, has the scooters that are capable of, for example, doing more accurate geofencing or emitting a sound. There's a difference between emitting any sort of sound and emitting a sound that actually works for those in the accessibility community. There was some testing originally, I know, that would have the sound very similar to the audible pedestrian signal. And having a sound that goes beep, beep, it's safe to cross the street, and beep, beep, watch out, I'm coming at you and I might hit you, is not probably the best use of a sound. So making sure that you have the right sound is also a part of it. But I know that, different, like I was saying, different parking models have been used in other parts of the world. And, originally, I think in San Francisco, it was park anywhere, at any time. People would leave them outside their house on a sidewalk that was 1.5 meters wide, and nobody who wanted to get by could get by without going out onto the roadway. So changing those kind of things are lessons, and I think the industry has matured, the technology has matured, and the municipal understanding of how those vehicles live in our environment has matured as well. And those three things have gotten us closer to where I'm hoping we have success. But time will tell, and we shall see.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Omar. The next question we have is, should vehicles, which I believe micromobility vehicles, be permitted on transit? If so, in what capacity? When there are mobility devices for goods movement. So I believe all of you have touched on this briefly, but if anyone would want to jump in on this question from your work and from your experiences in pilots.
So I'd like to jump in and say, one thing is whether they're permitted. So as an example, we allow a human to take their bicycle onto transit during certain hours. And that also means that someone that's working for food delivery could, and I've seen them on our subway vehicles. I don't know if they're permitted, but I've seen a person with a scooter who's on a delivery use the transit system, which makes a lot of sense for that person to execute their work that way. Having an automated vehicle have access to that, there's a lot of technical things about getting down to the platform and so forth. So I'm just thinking about subway or a bus, because we allow humans to take like a baby's carriage onto a bus, for example. There's an issue of space for the other users in the case of bus, and then there's the issue of access in the case of subway, and there's the issue of time. When the subway is busy, that would be a very bad idea. When the subway's not busy, it would be a potential idea, given that the technology can get there. I do want to say parenthetically that we're all probably mostly thinking about wheeled robots at this point, because that's what most of the things, it's even in my logo. We're probably going to see a majority of ambulatory robots. These are robots on legs by the, whether it's 6 years or 8 years from now, but a few years from now, a majority of robots are going to be on legs. In my opinion, that's not a known fact, it's just a guess. There's a lot of reasons that I'm guessing that. And now those machines, because that's what they are, would be able to physically get access to the subway platform. Now the question changes. I still think it should be restricted and constrained, but all of a sudden it's possible. So the question, which is a little premature, is actually a good question for not so far in the future.
Great, thank you, Bern. And we can take one final question here. And the next question is, should there be insurance requirements for e-bikes if we see a growing industry for them? So if someone can briefly touch on that question and that And by the way, we'll be sharing the links and information on all the speakers and how you can reach them if you have additional questions. But for time constraints, I would just take that last question if somebody wants to jump in on the insurance requirements for e-bikes.
From as I understand currently, I mean, bicycles don't require insurance. And so e-bikes currently don't require insurance. I think they're generally treated the same way. You know, so I think that's a simple answer for me.
Thanks, Omar, for sharing that thinking around that. And of course, we will share and post the details of all the work of the panelists and their details. So if you have any specific questions, definitely you could reach out through those details. But here's what I want to say. This was an amazing event. These devices, what a universe in itself. And I have to thank everyone for attending. A massive thanks to our esteemed panelists for that amazing discussion and the wonderful audience for the engagement. For those questions that were out there, certainly amazing. And please, we will share the information of the panelists. You can reach out to them. We hope you all had some form of takeaways from the discussion today and could use it in one way or another, especially the lessons learned from the pilots, the reports, the work, the panelists, the incredible work that they are doing. And a reminder that this session was recorded, so it will be available online in the next couple of weeks. We'll be following up with a link for everyone who attended, and for those who are interested in learning more, we will share resources and links, as I just said. But it's been a pleasure with our partners at the Ontario Ministry of Transportation and Metrolinx for this event. And please visit our website at ovinhub.ca for more details. Happy to close off our event today with many thanks to Maruk and the OVIN team. So I will end the event here, giving a minute or two back to you guys to get and have an early lunch. So have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you so much for your participation and engagement. This was great.